everyone. This is Peter from the Esoteric Order of Gamers. No, not you. Wait your turn. Don't wave yet.
Do you want to start again?
Yes, everybody. It's Mike Hutchinson, the amazing Mike Hutchinson, the creator of, and you can see it on his shelf up there, Gaslands, the amazing card combat tabletop miniatures game, which you all know and love, and we've shown here on the Esoteric Order of Gamers. Mike contacted me recently because he wanted to just say hi. No, I'm lying. He wants to talk about his new game. It's called Hobgoblin, the game of brutal fantasy battles. We're going to chat about that. We might chat about some other things too. It's late on a Friday evening here. I'm already on my third beer. Unfortunately for Mike, it's what, 7 o'clock in the morning over there?
Yeah, it's 8 o'clock and I'm on my first coffee. So this conversation will accelerate over the next 15 minutes.
You'll get faster, I'll get slower. We'll meet somewhere in the middle.
Perfect.
So, mate.
Hello, Peter. Yeah.
How you doing?
It was obviously with an ulterior motive that I reached out. The timing is, of course, because I've got a game on Kickstarter that you should go and look at. But also, Pete, we had a very nice time chatting last time, and I was looking forward to talking about it again. As I've obviously been watching your channel and particularly, looking at the games that are on my shelf that I'm sort of preparing, like there's Eon Trespass being painted up slowly. And so I look on with envy.
It's over there on my table there, taking up my whole table there, as it has for some time now, actually.
You probably look on with other people with envy that you don't get to play as many games as they do, but there's always a chain. There's always someone playing more board games than you.
There is. Damn them.
Yeah.
Aeon Trespass, yes, interesting game. You said what's the combat system like, and it's not bad though. There's a lot to remember, and which brings us to your game because there isn't a lot to remember about it because it's quite simple, isn't it? So what I want you to do, I want you to I was thinking about this, and I thought, can you imagine? Now use your powers of imagination here. Really, really work hard. I want you to imagine that I'm a quite old, jaded gamer who's played lots and lots of tabletop miniatures games over the years and is wondering, why should I buy another tabletop miniatures game? I know this is hard for you to imagine because obviously I'm not old or jaded.
And I'm trying to inhabit the character myself, obviously, anything like that.
It's hard. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. And tell me, why should we buy Hobgoblin? What's different?
Why should you buy a brutal fantasy battle game from me, designer of Gaslands? Well, so I have played a lot of rank and flank battle games over my career, and one of the ways that I particularly love to play is multiplayer and with lots of armies. And the thing about playing big battle games like this is that they tend to get like really quite a lot slower as they get bigger. And so one of my objectives was, can I make a really exciting, sweeping battle line game that just doesn't get exponentially slower and more sluggish and more soupy as you play with bigger armies? Because I got loads of figures and I love to get them out on the table, and that everything in this game is trying to remove slowdown moments and moments of fiddliness and pausing so that you're just constantly sort of cascading and tumbling towards doom and destruction for everyone. Because one of the inspirations for this is one of the feels I want for this is it's quite an old school feeling that I want to generate, although with quite modern rules. And one of the big inspirations is those maps that you get in White Dwarf battle reports in the 90s with the squares with the little triangles poking out of them, sort of moving around. And that experience of experiencing a battle at that sort of altitude and at that sort of speed was one of the things that I wanted to make sure came across. So you're not zooming into the micro detail of every combat and which hero is in which spot in which file of the combat and having to figure out
it's like that otherwise terrible film about Alexander that was made. There's that one fantastic scene where they have the big battle and they're following a hawk going over the battlefield.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Seen that movie? Terrible movie, but
I haven't seen the movie.
The battle set. Oh well, I forgot the name of the actor with blonde hair. It just doesn't work. Anyway, but yeah, there's a hawk flying over the battlefield, and the clouds sort of part, and you just see these huge chunks of troops running at each other from a huge distance above, which is very cool.
Yeah, and I've always loved the cinema of that when it comes to big block unit games on the table. And I just like, as with all of my games, I want the cinema to come across like as easily as possible without all of the sort of having to zoom in and zoom back out and lose the feeling of it. And the second thing is that I love painting monster miniatures. I love painting monster miniatures, and I also am much more of a hobby and model first and sort of game and winning second kind of a guy. And so the way that Hobgoblin allows you to build your armies is it basically says, here's some generic unit types, like heavy infantry, light infantry, monstrous infantry, and then you buy some upgrades or downgrades, some strengths or weaknesses, so that you can kind of customize them to be what you want. The intention being that anything that you paint, anything that you choose to paint, is pretty much just as viable as anything else. And if you sort of build an army list and you don't like the army list, you can tweak the army list really easily. You can kind of rebuild your army in game terms completely independently from the models that you're choosing to play. And obviously that's kind of true of many miniature agnostic games, but I've really pushed that to the fore to be like, the things that you paint and whether or not they're good on the table are completely independent decisions, and you can have fun with both of those, and you never have to like repaint, and you have to throw away an army that you've painted or throw away a unit that you've painted because its rules stink.
And presumably they could, you don't have to stick to particular things. You could have tiny figures and just say, these ones are monstrous.
Absolutely. Or
they're angry.
Exactly. Or you can combine models from ranges or races or factions that you want to, because it's just a sort of do what you want, pick and build sort of a system. So not only can you kind of invent anything that you want to fit in, but you can also combine anything that you want. And I like the fact that you can sort of, from game to game, you can mix up your tactics and try something and a bit like, I play quite a lot of deck building games, and I love the fact that you can kind of experiment with completely new tactics by just sort of putting all your cards back into the binder and then bringing them back. And there's a lot of pleasure in that. And when it comes to mini wargaming, that pleasure is real, but then it sort of has this direct effect on what hobby I have to do and what money I have to spend on miniatures and another 30 hours that I have to do painting. And so I wanted to break that wheel.
Much in the way you did with Gaslands, and that you just, broke this reliance on particular models. You could just go out and buy some, Hot Wheels cars and throw them in the dirt and kick them a bit and make them rough and they look post-apocalyptic, and off you go.
Yeah.
So this works practically in terms of the fact that you've got two base sizes, basically, haven't you? You've got is it narrow and wide for your, not base sizes, but what would you call it?
Well, so units are
unit sizes.
Units are just rectangles, and and there's a minimum and maximum dimension XY that you can say, well, if you're a sort of standard wide unit, which would be like, a block of infantrymen, then you have to be, between 100 and 200 millimeters wide, which basically maps to, a sensible number of square bases. Or one of these, what do I do? I use these conversion trays because I've got a lot of models. I've got a lot of models on circular bases, but you can, buy these sort of conversion trays where you just pop them in. And so, whether you're mounted on circles or squares, whether you decide to build an entire diorama, like you've got wide units, and then you've got sort of, chariots and those things, like narrow units.
I mean, the first thing I thought of is because all my figures are magnetized for storage, that I just have to cut trays which have a steel bottom or a steel base, and then I can just stick any miniatures on them in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. That would work. That would work perfectly. And so in the game, units just are the square. Like that's the thing that you get, is you get that rectangle. And if it's bigger or smaller within those boundaries, it's completely legal. And if it's bigger or smaller, then if it's a bit like in Gaslands, like cars in Gaslands are a bit like variable shapes, but there's positives and negatives to being bigger or smaller. And the same is true in Hobgoblin. Like a bigger unit is going to present more opportunities for people to like double charge it and so forth, but a smaller unit can fit into more places. And so
So there's no advantage for sort of having a deeper unit and having more figures hacking into someone?
So there's a third unit size, which only some unit types can buy, which is the Horde, and that requires you to have even bigger, but it's like twice as durable. And so you don't take figures off as you suffer casualties. What happens is there's a simple combat system where everybody rolls 10 dice. Each unit rolls 10 dice in combat, or 5 when it's shooting. And there's a slightly old school feeling, but I really like it, lookup table where you look up my unit and your unit type, and it goes, oh, it's a 4+ to hit. And it's very sort of 90s, and there's a part of me that hates it, but like it combines so much because you can get all of the sort of like, what's the looseness or closeness of the order, what's the relative armors, what's the strength and toughnesses, what's the armor saves, and then you just have this one dice roll that's just like, blap, this is how many hits the unit does. And for each hit you take a doom token, and the doom tokens are things that, like, in the doom phase at the end of the turn, if you've got more doom than courage, then you get taken off. So everything gets to act during their turn, and everything gets kind of...
And when you break, that's it, you're gone. You're off there.
Yeah, pretty much. So the doom phase, like, if you're broken, if you've got more doom, if you've got doom tokens equal to your courage or more, then first anything within 8 inches gets panicked and gets a doom placed on it as a result of you being broken.
Yeah.
And then you get taken off. And as a consolation prize for taking your unit off, you get to have either 2 mana tokens, and those are the things that you use to cast spells, or a fortune card. And fortune cards are a deck of things that you have in your hand that are sort of sneaky plots and tricks and extra buffs, so that during the game you've got some opportunity to swing the situation and take something that looked like an obvious situation and haha.
Nice. Because I mean, my first thought was like, well, if the whole unit goes and that causes other units to get doom tokens as well, isn't it going to fall apart like a, pack of dominoes?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of the design challenge was getting that domino stacking right, because like in a sort of fantasy medieval combat game, you want an element of that for sure, because like that's part of the cinema, is like, there's a big cavalry charge, it breaks the big unit, and then the line crumbles. And so it's balancing like what's a fun and exciting sort of end to a game that suddenly accelerates versus like, there's one unit, it happened to be the linchpin, a couple of bad dice rolls, bam, we're done. Oh, that was only a 30-minute game.
Yeah.
So there's
that thing, like, there's so many games, and one very popular one that I won't mention, where it can just descend into this interminable dice rolling slugfest in the middle where no one moves and you just take turns rolling dice. I have no idea which game this is. Could be any game.
So there's a couple things about Hobgoblin. Like, one is there's this incredibly fast combat resolution system where like you don't even get to roll saving throws. Like, I just roll some dice and you put some doom on, and that's part of this, like, I don't know, as I revisited the game, because it was a design from prior to Gaslands. Like, this was the original game I was trying to sell. This was the original game I was trying to sell to Offspray when they were like, they politely said no because they had Dragons Rampant just about to be released. And I was like, well, I've got some other games. Would you be interested?
It's crazy little thing called Gaslands. No one will like it. I'll give them that.
Exactly. Well, it was only like an 8-page prototype at the time that I was speaking to them.
Wow.
And so I kind of put Gaslands on the back burner for a while. I put Hobgoblin on the back burner for a while back in like 2015, and I picked it up a couple of years ago, and I liked a lot of what was in there, but some of it still seemed like the core of the game, like the core principle of the game seemed to be, how brutally fast can you make this? And any extra rules, particularly any moments where you're handing over from between players, because every time you hand control from one player to another, there's this slowdown where you have to remind the other player, and they're checking their phone or drinking their tea or whatever. And so even that exchange of like, I roll some dice, you roll some saves, like, it's fine in many cases, but if you're trying to make a really big sweeping game be extremely quickly, then those are the kinds of things that I ended up. But
what you've done is, I mean, it strikes me, I was going to say with the chart, as soon as I saw the chart, I went, oh no, a chart, because I didn't want to look up anything during the game.
Yeah.
But then I realized, because you've cross-indexed the different types of units, you've basically taken away all the need for individual stats, because
that's right.
you've taken the strength and weaknesses of excuse me, one unit against another unit and said, well, that's what you need with that combination of units. And you're doing that in one go. So I thought, oh, that's actually very clever, because yeah, it just takes away all the need for that extraneous stuff, because you are not saying, I mean, one thing that frustrates me sometimes is you have a unit that's really strong and it needs a certain amount to hit or do damage or something, and it doesn't take into account the defending unit or vice versa, but this takes into account both in one go.
Yeah, to try and remove a lot of what is essentially other lookup tables, and to combine like, four or five dice rolls into one. And so the same thing is like,
we need to wound. I hate to wound.
Exactly.
Just take that out.
Exactly.
Just have to hit and to defend. That's it.
And then,
to save, but you don't need to wound when you've already hit.
And then the Doom tokens themselves are like a combination of morale and wounding. And it's like, I don't really care why the unit ceases to be combat effective, whether it's all completely dead and bloody, or whether it's fled, or whether it's just cowering. Like, it's sort of at the scale that we're trying to get to, it doesn't matter. Like, the unit either matters in this game or it doesn't. And so having a Doom that's like, a sort of generic thing means that you don't have to worry about a specific wounding system versus a specific, morale test system and so forth.
And it takes it out of the combat system and puts it into the Doom phase.
And then the other comment about your kind of like, there's a big jam in the middle and it just turns into exchanges of dice rolls. One thing that I've kept flexible in Hobgoblin is, even once you're locked in, even once you're touching and in combat, you've still got the ability to sort of shuffle around and continue to move, which is a bit weird for a rank and flank game, but it means that I quite like the lapping round rule from like 4th edition, 3rd and 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy. It's not implemented very well, but I like that cinema of like, units continue to like, there's like a rugby scrum and things are moving. And
that's really good. Yeah.
Because the challenge is exactly as you say, that like, once combat is joined, like, just an enormous number of decisions evaporate, and now you're like, well, we're just in resolution mode, and that's not.
And I love the fact that when you get in contact in your game, the combat happens, and even if it's just corner to the unit, as soon as they're touching, combat's on, which I love, because there's this whole thing, and Conquest, for example, does this, is that when you charge into combat, you get a free 90-degree wheel, then you charge, then you get another free 90-degree to snap into place. And it just I feel like sort of as if I'm getting all this huge free thing. I mean, I've done the charge roll, I've made the charge roll, but still I'm getting a lot of free stuff. And what it really comes down to is that I can just take my unit and plonk it exactly straight up against the other unit, and everything's straight up and magnetizes together, and it just doesn't quite feel right to me.
Yeah, I'll be honest, that like, how do you get units to charge each other and then the battle line to tidy itself up? That was one of the most challenging parts of designing this game, because we have this history of straightening up the line, because it's cinematically, we're like, well, these people aren't going to stand like 2 foot away from each other going, well, I'll just wait for my turn next round. Of course they're all going to charge in and blah, blah, blah. But like, the same logic can apply to like, well, I left a little triangle between 2 units that are slightly at an angle. Well, obviously there are dudes running in and joining battle in that area. And like, these units of squares are abstractions anyway. We can either decide that the abstraction is we move the squares together, or the abstraction is, of course, people are poking each other across that little empty triangle that's left on the table.
Well, and also, as you say, like, might be something really quick. There might be a quick moment, and then you move, and there's another quick moment. Each actual attack is very fast.
Yeah, and the finickiness and the extra wording and rules that you have to put in for this sort of like, whether I can do this and how much and how can I stop people from like weirdly going around this, like, it's just, you just end up with more rules, and then you try and execute them and you're like, is this really making the game better, or shall I just smash 2 units together?
So are there games you like that do have lots of rules, or do you always want to simplify things?
Yeah, there are lots of games I like with lots of rules, but like, I guess like,
I'm not accusing you of anything here.
I can pick on Fantasy Flight because I love them and they're big enough to be picked on. Yeah. But like, Fantasy Flight is a great example of like, they have a design philosophy that's like, there is never too many rules. No rule
Yeah.
should ever be removed from our games. And it's ridiculous, and it becomes like, there are games we've talked before. I still absolutely love Arkham Horror, the card game, but like quite often a session will descend into like, what is the timing of the thing with the and then you're going through this massive like.
But it's not so much that; it's more like,
rules.
I forgot to do this last turn, and now we have to rewind to do that little thing, or it's too late to rewind it now because it has too many implications.
Exactly.
And I've been finding that a lot with a lot of the games I've played lately, and I just think, well, it's either they're getting more and more complicated and I can't deal with it because I can't be bothered, or I'm getting old or whatever. But I just think if there's a rule system which you play quite a lot and you still are getting to the point where you're forgetting things and going back and checking them, maybe that's not my fault. Maybe that's the game system's fault, Well,
because ultimately, like, board games and tabletop games, they're software that like executes on our meat computer. And if we're having to spend most of our time remembering exceptions and things that we're supposed to trigger, and this kind of like sort of tedious operation of the game, then that's just percentage of our enjoyment and our brain space that's not being spent on decision making. And so in a game
making
like
making pew noises and going,
and so if there's time being spent on that stuff which could have been spent making decisions, then I think the challenge of making a good, elegant tabletop games design is to say, well, if we took away these rules, would it, it might reduce the sort of realism or the exact sort of thing that we're trying to go for, but does it change the balance in terms of what strategic decisions I'm able to focus on, in which case, like, do we need this detail and can we implement this in a simpler way? So I like simpler rules insofar as it biases to thinking about the decisions I need to make rather than operating what could have been like an automated computer game, but it turns out that I have to do all the algorithm.
Well, the good thing now is that we could choose, isn't it? I mean, depending what mood we're in, we can choose the type of game we want to play.
Yeah, so it's just a ridiculous set of options these days.
Yeah, but isn't that fantastic? Because you can just say, okay, I'm really going to go for a whole afternoon's gaming now. We're going to get deep and meaty into this game. We're really going to, get into all the detail. Or you can just say, oh, gee, I really just want to have a bash over a few beers and not think about it too much. And you can just go, oh, I'll have that game. Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely. And, to be honest with you, part of the reason I'm a games designer is I do really like pulling the levers of games. And part of the reason that I'm quite bad at winning games is that I'm not that focused on like knotting together the perfect strategy. I'm quite often the pleasure is just like, oh, I got to pull the levers of this rule system and had like, I won because I got to play with this sort of digger. And so like, as long as the machinery is pleasurable to mess about with, it sort of doesn't matter how complicated it is, as long as it's still enjoyable to putz about with. I find this with solo games quite a lot. Like quite often solo games don't have that much decision making, but if they're pleasurable to operate, then that's like, it's like playing Patience or something. It's like, well, I
find it hard to get my head around solo games. I just
really
keep trying. But yeah, I really do. I mean, I play them, but I don't get the same pleasure out of them. I really don't.
Would you just rather play a video game?
Oh no, I'd just rather play a game with someone else. I mean, to me, it's a social activity, and it's the whole enjoyment of it is playing a game with somebody else and having a laugh and having a company and all that. Doing it by myself, just sort of I just don't get the same enjoyment out of it, and I don't get as immersed in it. And often because they're solo games like Aeon Trespass, ISS Vanguard, things like that. I mean, I did a review of ISS Vanguard recently. I don't know if you saw it, but I was so impressed by it. There's so much creativity. It's so fantastic, but I just don't have the time to get into it and devote so much time to it. And Aeon Trespass is the same. It's an amazing thing. And the story is incredible and all the rest of it. And the combat system is really deep and all the rest of it. But again, it's just like, wow, am I going to sit here for 2 hours for a day for the next 4 months playing this, or am I going to get in games with friends? And
well, I think those games, a bit like sort of, oh bother, what's it called? Anyway, there's a number of games like this with these deep campaign systems where I kind of feel like as a gaming group, you either oscillate between two modes, or you choose which kind of gaming group you are, and you're like, we're the kind of gaming group that's going to play this game for 6 months and really enjoy going deep on it as a gang, or we're going to play a new thing every week and we're going to learn a completely new. And my gaming group's kind of oscillated.
Definitely the latter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think my group sort of is to a large degree, but then we'll fall into campaign holes with these big deep games, and we'll do that for 6 months, and then we'll want to palette cleanse and play a load of one-off games where we're learning the rules each time. So I think with something like Ian Trespass, it sort of comes down to either you're the person who is choosing to spend their time doing that as a solo activity rather than putting 200 hours into Elden Ring or whatever.
Oh, they're so much like video games. I mean, this is what something else I mentioned. It really is like, especially the video games where you want to collect everything and do all the collectibles and do everything that the game has to offer. It feels like that sometimes. And this is why I never say, well, this game is good or bad or anything like that, because everybody has different preferences, and some people are just going to absolutely get off on that type of game, and other people it's not going to be for them. So I think it's really a matter of just personal choice. But anyway, miniatures games. So what else have you we'll get back to Hobgoblin again, but what other miniatures games have you been playing? Hobgoblin.
What have I been playing?
Reminds me. Cheers.
What have I been playing recently? Playing a fair bit of Saga Age of Magic, which I really like, and playing some Frostgrave because a friend of mine absolutely adores rolling on random tables for potions. Sort of doesn't matter what the rest of the game is, he just likes that part.
Whatever turns you on, that's fine.
Yeah, exactly. What do we do? We painted up the figures for Cursed City, played a couple of games, and then agreed we would go and download the extra rules from Board Game Geek, and haven't got around to that point.
I've painted the core set and played a little bit of solo. The
miniatures, oh my goodness, so glorious.
Miniatures are gorgeous. I mean, they're fantastic. It's just the game system, but I was never a huge fan even of the first Silver Tower one. That just
well, actually, in warming up to play that first game, we played a couple because a friend of mine was like, "Oh, you've got all these new Warhammer Quest ones. Can we start playing them?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I haven't got Silver Tower out for a while." And we played the first couple of missions of Silver Tower, and we were like, there's so much to almost like here about the presentation. Like the artwork in the book is glorious, but like the actual game is really.
Yeah, well, everyone said that Cursed Tower is so melee focused that it just becomes a grind because it's just kill a thing, go to the next thing, kill a thing. There's no, and I noticed there's been 2 expansions, and I've got both of them, but still not much in the way of range combat or anything. It's always about getting people in close, and so there's not a whole lot of room for strategy or stuff like that.
So I've got the old Warhammer Quest roleplay book and rules up on the shelf. I rebought the. I never had the set as a kid. My buddy John did, but I rebought the rules books off eBay so that we can sort of use all these lovely, beautiful equipment from the new games, but maybe just play the old Hammer version.
That's not a bad idea. Where is my copy?
I can see it there. It's just underneath Advanced Hero Quest between Blood Bowl and...
Oh, here, yes. Oh, there we go.
Glorious.
In camera. Advanced Hero Quest, Warhammer Quest, yes.
Beautiful.
And there's Hero Quest around. I've got 2 copies of Hero Quest around here somewhere too.
Oh, you can't quite see, but just above this copy of New Hero Quest, just up there is a set of... It's 2 copies of Mighty Empires, which are currently being into completion.
Excellent.
Because I really want to play that again. Oh, yeah, what's the other thing? I played some 7TV recently, which really some 7TV Pulp. It was the one that I played.
Oh, never heard of it.
Oh, it's fantastic. So it's British, small British company called Crooked Dice, who make this incredibly lovely selection of this will sound rude, but I mean this with love, slightly lumpy old school metal sculpts of all kinds of pulp and classic TV stuff. And then they have this sort of set of games like Pulp, 7TV, sort of Spy-Fi, and 7TV Pulp, and 7TV something else. There's a fantasy one. And they're a really nice game system that a bit like Gaslands, it really leans into its premise. And so the premise of 7TV is you are a TV show producer and the game is the TV show. And so there's card decks and all the language is about, like, you know, when cast members get enough wounds, they get axed, and there's a set of cards that like have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So the game accelerates in this really interesting way because each turn you flip out a card, and depending on where you are in the sort of episodic arc, like different kinds of events will happen. So I mean, at its heart, it's sort of an objective-based skirmish game, but just there's so much to like about the presentation of it. And there's some really smart stuff in the activation rules, and it's a really tidy, well-considered design.
Talking about pulp, you did a game called Perilous Tales.
I did, yeah.
What's
still available to download for free in beta form. It will at some point reach its final form and become a hardback book. I mean, that's a pure solo game, so you know, of no interest in beta at all.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's move on. Well, it looked like it had a slight sort of Indiana Jones feel.
Yeah, 100%. Like
Indiana Jones.
Absolutely love buying and collecting pulp miniatures, and particularly.
I don't know if I told you that my 40th birthday party was an Indiana Jones themed event.
Really?
And I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it the other day because I decorated the whole place and Indiana Jones, and everyone came along in costume. But of course, we had lots of Nazis because it was Indiana Jones. And I just thought, I looked back on the photos and just went,
"Oops."
You know, yeah. I mean, this was 17 years ago, but still, it didn't cross my mind or anyone's mind back then. And I just thought, wow, that's really weird to look at it now, that there's no way that we would do that now.
Yeah, the first time I went to a war games convention, I was demoing Gaslands, and there was Iron Cross, which is like a World War II game. And there was just a bunch of people dressed as Gestapo playing their sort of army. And I was like, wow, this is super weird. I haven't because I haven't really done any historical gaming. And I'm sure it doesn't happen everywhere, but it was quite surprising.
Yes, it's problematic.
It is problematic.
Anyway, so Perilous Tales. So that's sort of
moving on to a different game and talking slightly along these terms. So I've got hasn't really been talked about very much yet, but I've got a new Osprey game cooking along in the background. So I'm doing a blue book for them called Pacific Command, and this is my first. This is my first foray into a historical sort of type of game.
Okay.
But of course, I'm going to be tackling it in my own specific way. So the long story short is I've been playing a lot of A Billion Suns, and it just occurred to me, I can't remember exactly what the scenario was, but it just occurred to me that like this would make an interesting base for a naval game. And because a lot of A Billion Suns is about like things appearing and then things launching out of other things, I thought, do you know what this really, really makes me think of is the sort of fog of war, cat and mouse stuff with aircraft carriers that happens in the Pacific War between the US and the Japanese. And so I just sort of started thinking about that and started tinkering around and ended up pushing away from A Billion Suns, but at least with like a number of the sort of core, at least concepts from that game, and thinking, well, how could I make a game with a sort of double blind system where neither of you know where the other people's sort of ships are, and that like launching aircraft from aircraft carriers is sort of like your ranged attack, like that's kind of your gun, if you like. And so I've ended up sort of creating this quite zoomed out, but still very much a miniature game, naval game, which is trying to not just be like ships go pop, 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 and then exchange fire, but is a sort of it's almost like a stealth game. It's under the hood, it's more like a stealth mech game than it is a naval war game. But of course, that works really well if you zoom out to the level of like task forces of, you know, a single unit is basically like an entire task force that's got an aircraft carrier and its destroyers and, you know, it's aircraft. So yes,
were you interested in this period, or do you know anything about it, or did you just?
No, not really. There's a ton of books now on my shelf. You can see one there, Pacific.
Certainly had to learn.
Yeah, no, I just got fascinated by the general premise, and then just thought, well, I'm 40 now. I read about military history. It's fine.
Yeah, well, yeah. I never fell into that trap, but yeah, sure.
Probably going to be coming out in 2024. So I've still got plenty of time to be working on it. But it's also because the challenge of working on A Billion Suns was like ultimately naval war games are difficult to make truly interesting because you don't have things like terrain. And traditionally, the sort of right way to do things is that, yeah, genuinely ships do just kind of potter towards each other and then knock the snot out of each other, and you just roll a bucket of dice. So Billion Suns was trying to attack that problem of how to make a spaceship game more interesting and dynamic. And the same thing is true here. I wanted to attack it in a slightly different way and say, because like fog of war is a super interesting and difficult thing to achieve, and having a double blind system where both players are completely both players are uncertain of both where the opposing units are and whether or not they are close to discovering those units. Like there's lots of juicy game design challenges there that I'm having fun with.
I know what I was going to think of. Dystopian Wars. Have you played Dystopian Wars?
I haven't. No, I really should give it a go, because a lot of that seems to be the main thing.
That's all Dystopian Wars are down there. Look.
Goodness me, is that all the most recent stuff, or is that?
There's some old stuff there too. Yeah, there's smaller fleet boxes in those large boxes and stuff like that. But it's a great game. It's really good.
I'm off to talk to the Man Battle Stations podcast on Sunday, and they absolutely love that game as well, and they're dyed in the naval war gamers. But they have a ton of. But it's quite. In my understanding of that game, having played a bit of some of its sister games, like the spaceship one, is that it's quite what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's quite arcadey. It's quite sort of cartoony. There's lots of exploding dice. It's fairly and bits and stuff. Like it feels like quite a fun sort of like Man of War.
Well, you've got Zeppelins and cybernetic whales and all this kind of stuff as well. So it's certainly not going for realism.
Yeah.
But this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's about making games that get across either the atmosphere of the theme or the particular type of mechanics that you're interested in, or not mechanics, but the as you say, that kind of stealth thing that you're looking for in that. And it's that specific thing. Whereas in the old days, of course, when they were making games, it was all about trying to get some kind of strange realism and verisimilitude.
Yeah, for me, like I think it's almost, rather than those two things being separate, it's like for me the objective is this alchemy where like something happens in your brain when you're playing, which is these completely abstracted, nothing to do with the reality of what the theme is. These abstracted mechanics and the miniatures somehow come together to create at least the same excitement and sense of like watching a car chase or seeing a sweeping battle line in Lord of the Rings or something. And it's weird because they're completely unrelated neurons firing. And that I think that's the fun, is like how do you create an excitement and a sense in the player, even though it's just rolling dice and pushing miniatures around. But it does work. In the best games, you do get excited and kind of into.
And we always use the word cinematic when we're describing something that's good. We just say, "Oh, it's such a cinematic moment," and that's why I play too. I play for those moments, and I try and do in those battle reports as we get those. When I often find you do something, and then afterwards, or just after it, you say, "Oh, he ran this way and he tried to do this, blah, blah, blah," and you flesh out the whole situation, and it becomes this amazing cinematic moment because you've fleshed it all out.
Exactly.
Well, you sort of played the mechanics, and as it was happening, this narrative was appearing in your head, and then you like to sort of describe that in detail afterwards.
Totally.
And that's what it's all about, really. I reckon. I don't know, for me anyway.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Have you tried Relicblade?
I have. Look, you can you can see it there. Yeah, no, I really like that.
It's great, isn't it? I love it.
You put it on the table recently. I think I saw a battle report.
I've done one battle report, but we played it a few times. I love it. And I have to say, it's the only tabletop miniatures game I've ever played where I didn't redesign the unit cards.
Because they're so
The only one.
gloriously laid out already.
They're wonderfully simple, and all the information is there, and you don't need to change it. It looks great. It's easy to
Yeah, and because
access.
they're hand illustrated, it almost feels like, I don't know. Yeah, he's such a
It's part of the
Renaissance
game.
man, Sean. He's such a
Oh,
Renaissance man. Like
unbelievable.
he does the text, the game design, the text, the layout, the illustration. He writes the theme song. It's incredible.
He writes the theme song.
No, I don't think that part's true. But he sculpts the miniatures, which
I know, it's insane.
because he's got a fine art illustration background, and one day he was just like, I'm going to learn ZBrush, and it's going to be difficult, but I'm just going to do it.
Wow.
Which, I mean, like you must have woken up one day and just be like, I'm going to learn Photoshop, or you just started using it until you.
Oh, I've learned how to do 3D and stuff, but doing it for miniatures is an entire different thing. Of course, I recreated the entire site of Chichen Itza for a computer game once. I mean, that was something.
Really?
But making figures and also making them so they can be sculpted, because there's a whole technical aspect to that as well, which is another thing. But yeah, I mean,
you just got to put your hours in, don't you? You just got to put your hours
in.
You
do. I can't be bothered anymore.
Well, I mean, I find, and this is very, I don't do game design as my main mortgage paying job, so I'm very cautious with like spending my time on the things that my brain wants to do, and my brain wants to design games and playtest games. I don't really want to figure out how to publish games or how to manage getting the book made or getting it shipped out to people. So with the Hobgoblin Kickstarter, I'm working with Greg, who was the graphic designer and sort of general editor-in-chief of the Blaster project. And he's...
Oh, and how many? There's 4 issues now, isn't there?
There's 4 issues. And then
is that it, or are there going to be more?
Well, there's a 5th one coming out in, I think, June. But with the 5th, the format's changing a little bit for a few reasons. But basically the format from 5 onwards is going to be smaller, and it's going to be like a single game from a single designer, so that you can actually like pick up a thing that you want, rather than being in the anthology format.
I think I've only got the first 2, which is an outrageous situation. I
shall send you the others.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd say that. Thank you.
Right, all right. Yeah, because issue 3 gets
anyway.
Well, I was going to say issue 3 gets you Sludge from Sean, which is his mass battle game, which is somewhat similar it's got a little bit of a similar flavor to Hobgoblin in that it's obsessed with doom metal and blood, and is trying to create a very sort of gloomy and vicious situation on the battlefield. But
what is it about tabletop gamers and heavy metal?
I don't know. I don't know.
I've never been a heavy metal fan. It's not. I mean, Rush is about as heavy as it got for me. Which is, it's not very heavy.
It's not very heavy.
But it's, I used to walk into Games Workshop and it was like, God, it's music. Terrible.
I mean, for me, like a lot of heavy metal albums that I like have dragons on the front of them. It's not
that's true.
It's not that far removed from having a set of sci-fi and fantasy novels.
Actually, I say I'm not into, but the first music I did drum to was Iron Maiden. So
right, there you go.
The Killers album. That was the first thing I stuck on the headphones when I got a drum kit. So there you go.
Fantastic.
I do have a bit of cred. Yeah. So he's doing the work on the Kickstarter, is he?
Yeah, so Greg is he basically quit his job at an advertising agency. He's a graphic designer at an ad agency, and he was having such a good time with us on Blaster. He was like, damn it, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to do the thing. I'm going to start a games company. So he's done a couple of projects before, but this Hobgoblin's the first kind of big mini game project that he's doing. And so that's fab, because he is doing the things that I don't want to do, like the things I can't do, like making the layout amazing and making the branding cool, and all the stuff I don't want to do, which is like figuring out how to get a book printed and figuring out how to get it into players' hands and stuff. So to that point of like, I can't be bothered to learn a thing. Like it's like I don't beat myself up about not learning things if they're not the things that like I'm naturally wanting to do. Then it's like, well, that's a different person's passion. I'm not.
No, I do wonder. There was a time where sometimes you forced yourself to do things that you didn't want to do, but they ended up being very useful and actually enjoyable once you'd learned how to do them, kind of thing.
That's true. That's true.
So, back to Hobgoblin. There's a magic system and everything. Have you got pages and pages of spells and stuff?
So what do we got? Yeah, so there's some. You're referring to the quick start rules, which you can download from the Kickstarter.
Yeah, that's all I've got
which
at
is
the moment.
like
Yep.
we condense the rules onto just four sheets of paper. And obviously the core rules are a little bit more expansive than that. And the magic system includes something like, what is it, like 8 or 10 schools of magic, each of which have 3 spells. And so you just choose a school of magic and you get a little quick reference card. And that wizard can then cast these 3 spells. And there's something like 30 spells in these batches of 3. But the spells are mostly like, I'm really focused on how can you change the way that the army behaves, or the way that you can kind of build an army to do cool stuff. So very few of the spells, in fact, if there are any direct damage spells, they still are getting the side eye from me and might be removed. But it's less about like fireball this thing for d6 damage and more about like, okay, now they have flying and can behave in a different way.
That's really interesting, because it's again, it's all about making it cinematic and interesting. Like, one thing that drives me nuts are these sort of spells and abilities and things that say you've got +1 strength, and it's not interesting. It's not exciting. Doesn't do anything. And also, when it comes down to it, all it does is just change the possible probabilities of a dice roll by an infinitesimal amount. So
yeah, one of the things, and I'm not sure I've completely executed against this, but like one of the thoughts was the point of like the cinema of magic is that impossible things happen. Like that's almost the definition of magic. And so bulking, like buffing and debuffing, is a really natural mechanical use for them. But what's sort of more interesting is each spell should allow the unit to break a rule, because that's a sort of representation of that, like happening, of the impossible thing happening. And I think that's probably not true enough in magic systems in enough games. Is like the thing that happens is, an impossible thing that, breaks the rules. And the other thing, go ahead.
Go on. No, you go ahead.
The other thing alongside magic and like not having direct damage is that the shooting phase got quite a lot of kicking from me, because I really, really don't like a fantasy battle game turning into a sort of laser gun shooting match, because it's just not what I'm here for. And I also don't like these monster miniatures that I've painted being cannoned off in the first turn. So shooting is very much weakened compared to other games in Hobgoblin, and so you can
5 dice instead of 10, isn't it?
5 dice instead of 10, and there's a maximum amount of damage that you can put onto a unit using shooting. So you can actually never really remove things other than some exceptional circumstances using shooting. And that's basically because, I don't want to incentivize standy back armies. Standy back armies should be able to be just about viable, but like if the one thing that you can't really do in Hobgoblin is a dwarf gun line that never moves, like boohoo, whatever.
No. And tell us about the background, because it seems to have quite an unusual background as well.
Oh yeah. So when I wrote
that map, the map is fantastic.
Oh yeah, that was the beginning of the experiment. So when I wrote the game all those years ago, it was very much a generic thing that was just like, I'm writing the rule system because that's cool. And then when Greg and I agreed to start making this into a beautiful product, he was like, look, I'm starting a game company. I can't have a generic rule set. Give me something glorious for us to, build into and make wonderful. And so I started with thinking, because, all fantasy things have already been done. So I'm not going to come up with anything completely unique, but it's just like, well, where do I start that's attention grabbing? And the first image that came into my mind was, instead of having a world map that is horizontal, let's have a world map that's vertical, and let's have a sort of descending dungeon realm where, and then I went immediately to look up like how many miles deep is the Earth's crust, and it's like 2,000 miles deep or something. It's like, oh, amazing. Okay, so now I've got
lots of space. Excellent.
Yeah, I've got 2,000 miles of tunnels going down, and of course, if I draw you a map, that's only one tiny slice of the apple. I could take a different slice from anywhere in this globe. I'm pretty sure there's a Ian M. Banks novel that I slightly, that is very much like this, like a hollow world thing. So. The world of Hobgoblin is called Rotwalden, the root world, and the surface of the world is dead and frozen, and that it's an icy apocalypse, and there's maybe, you know, skeletons and wraiths and stuff, and the remnants of dead civilizations. But all of these fantasy races have long since burrowed into the crust of the earth, digging these monstrous tunnels and these huge cavern cities. And so there's sort of these different realms as you go down the map, and it starts with the and I had to invent a name for up and down. So you've got Ist and Eld, meaning kind of up and down, or cold and hot. And so it starts with this sort of frozen, the cold is descending and pushing people down into the sort of temperate zone, which is the Stenhal, and then into the sort of, as it gets lower, you get warmer, and there's these kind of swampy sort of mushroom jungle type environments. And
got to have mushrooms.
You got to have mushroom jungles, and then it gets all the way down to the bottom, where you're like really close to the sort of, you know, molten core. And that's where, you know, your infernal dwarfs and your fire demons, and there's this massive wall that's built by someone in the past that's protecting the, you know, the fire demons from escaping out. So you've got this kind of you've got this sort of fire and ice sort of encroaching on the world. And that was the look. That was the sort of general setup. And then of course everything's tunnels, and it's all, you know. But it also occurred to me that, like, given that space, you can also have, you know, there's plenty of space for like entire underground seas and enormous cavern cities, and, you know, shafts with waterfalls that fall for 1,000 miles, and all of this, like, you know, fantastic visuals kind of poured into my mind. And then the next part of it was like, okay, fine, we've got this sort of, you know, it's not completely unique, you know, there's an entire Dungeons and Dragons setting that's kind of a bit like this with the Underdark, and there's other things
original.
Yeah, nothing's original. But one of the questions is, it's a fantasy battle game. Lots of armies are going to be fighting, and lots of people are going to have armies all the time. Like, why? What's going on that means you've constantly got all these troops and stuff? And so one of the things that's the sort of core conceit that's going on is that as people sort of built all these tunnels and were expanding the networks here and there in different places, they accidentally stumbled across or punctured through into a much more ancient network of tunnels carved by some, you know, antediluvian sort of race of people who were building something similar. And so as they kind of punch through and find these elder routes, in them they start to discover these cursed artifacts. And, you know, I imagine these adventurers, or, you know, sellswords, or, you know, final members of regiments, whatever, discovering these artifacts. And what the cursed artifacts gives these people is the ability to manifest enormous armies, you know, through a number of different mechanisms. It could be like, you know, mudmancy to make golems, or, you know, reanimating things, or spiritual, you know, spirit things, or whatever it is. They get the ability to create these armies and create them at will. But as they're using that power, they're getting this sort of whoever made the artifact originally is starting to sort of encroach, consume their life force, begin to inhabit them, and, you know, find a way to reincarnate
Precious.
them. Exactly. So, you know, essentially, like, there's a ton of these cursed artifacts, which are, you know, exactly as you would imagine, you know, corrupting artifacts.
I can see the game designer's brain, because it's not just coming up with stuff. It's like, well, if that happens, then this has got to happen. Well, why is that happening? You're sort of pursuing the reality of it.
Yeah, that's right. Because it's got to hang together as a game setting as much as like. My primary intention was not to write novels in this setting. It was to provide something that really hangs together. Because like, one of the things it needed to do was it needed to say, hey, all of the fantasy tropes exist in this world, because you want to be using whatever armies you've got. But also because of the generic army building system, I want to say, but there's also a ton of space for, you know, whatever you want, like blind fishmen, octopus demons, like whatever it is that you want to build also needs some way to fit into it. And so this endless underground sort of Rotwalden gives us all the space to mess about with that. And then
it's good. I mean, it's got that Gaslands feel as well, because you could go out and buy toys and stick them on a thing and paint them, and, you know, you don't have to use expensive miniatures if you just feel like some games.
Yeah,
there's something different, you know. You could get those sort of little rubbery things that stick on the end of your finger, and, you know, get 10 of those and put them on. It's like, you know, the jellyfish men, you know. You could.
You could.
Be great.
And then
quite tempted to do that.
And then Greg challenged me. He was like, "We need to have some background," and I was like, "Okay, cool. I don't mind writing some background, but I don't want to write one of those travelogues that you get in role-playing games." And I don't want to it's like a Lonely Planet guide to the setting where it's like, and then this boring thing happened, and here's the
city of blah 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 has got 7,000 people and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, exactly. So I haven't ever written any narrative fiction, but a virtual novella of nonsense emerged over the last year of me learning how to write. And Greg found me this friend of his who's a science fiction and fantasy writer, and he was very, very patient with his mentoring of me. So that's been a fun experiment. It's like having learned how to do kind of writing games design. It turns out writing fiction, it's just this whole other barrel of fish where I just didn't know any of the rules. I didn't know where the pitfalls were, and so my first stumbling attempts were just hilariously bad, and it's been a fun sort of new skill to build, to the point of to our point of learning new skills and forcing yourself to do it. That's actually something that I wouldn't have done naturally, but it was nice to have the thumb screws on and then a deadline and having to do it.
10 years later, we'll be talking with the famous author, Mike Hutchinson, who is publishing his 7th novel set in the underground world of his making.
Oh, yeah, actually, I'm wearing the Hobgoblin t-shirt.
Oh, look, yeah. Now, I'm a graphic designer, and I can't read that logo at all.
That's intentional, yeah.
Oh, no. I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, that's the thing. You got to know it to know it. I have a lot of t-shirts like this with impenetrable spiky logos. I mean, this one, to me, this one's a little bit too. This one's a little bit too legible.
I can't read it. Make it readable, you young whippersnapper.
Oh my goodness! There's a giant hornet in my room. Where the heck did that come from?
Yes. What? Oh God! Get bitten on live TV.
Yeah. Although I shouldn't complain about insects to an Australian.
No, I'm in New Zealand now, and we don't have any. Well, we do have insects, but nothing that bites and kills you, which I grew up with.
Yeah.
Every time you dug in the garden, I was, there's a funnel web spider or a redback that could kill you. Oh, never mind. Keep digging. When I was younger and I started playing D&D, I think, maybe this was before I started playing D&D. I had this thing about, this is very common, wanting to dig an underground lair, and so I went out into the back garden and started digging. And I had this vision of sort of, a shaft going down into a room or something like that. And that would be my secret place. I think I got about that deep. And then I came home one day from school, and I hadn't done it for a while, but the hole was still there. And there was a digger sitting on the back, in the garden, and they dug up the whole area. I don't know, Mum and Dad had decided to do something with the garden or something. And I was going, my lair, my hole, ruined. It was going to be huge. It did give me an excuse to no longer dig.
It was going to be an entire dungeon realm.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. I think that was actually pre-D&D, so that might have been, I discovered D&D when I was 12, so probably earlier than that.
Wow. So you were super ready for it.
The urge was there, yeah. I was a vessel waiting to be filled, as they say.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah. Are you doing any role-playing at all while we're talking about
haven't done much recently. I picked up what did I pick up recently? I picked up a copy of DCC because I was intrigued about that. And I picked up I was in a game shop, and they had a damaged copy of Horror on the Orient Express for Call of Cthulhu, and it just had had a big old ding in the hardback spine, but it was like 70% off. So I was like, yes, let me get
nice.
Let me get involved.
I just hold on. Talking about DCC, this is the new Dying Earth box set.
Nice.
Oh, look, I didn't even realize
this.
Look at that. Yeah.
Cool.
First time I realized that.
So I haven't actually played any DCC. I've just read it. What's your... Have you had a chance to play it?
Yes. Well, we played DCC Lakmar, set in Fritz Leiber's world.
Yeah.
For 2.5 years.
Oh, crumbs.
So yeah, pretty regularly, once a week, with
Well,
some
that's an
breaks,
endorsement.
2.5 years. So yeah, it was huge, absolutely fantastic. And the great thing about Lakmar, and in fact in DCC as well, it's total gonzo fantasy. So you can put anything in there.
Right.
You can do anything. So they did have a series of Lakmar adventures, but they could only do so many, obviously. But then I could easily tweak the existing DCC modules and put them into the world, and they worked really well.
So I have a question for you, because
Yeah.
one thing about this rulebook, like, it's so big. One thing about this rulebook really confused me.
Yeah.
It's that, like, the spells section is about that big. It's about like a third of the book is just spells, and then the bit about treasure is like 2 pages long and sort of says, "Don't worry about it. Like, there isn't any treasure. It's a medieval fantasy realm."
Yeah.
So I was assuming that this was going to be a sort of looting type of game, but it doesn't seem that the rules expect that to be true. Like, what?
No, it's not looting. I mean, in the same way that there's not a big monster section, and that the monsters and treasure are sort of supposed to be things that you make up. And if you're going to, there's no sort of section of treasure that says, this is a bag of holding or whatever, because you can come up with a bag of anything you want in your game.
Okay.
And you just come up, and it really does. It rewards coming up with shit on the fly, which is great. And this game that we played for 2.5 years, it's the least amount of preparation I've ever done for a role-playing game. I totally threw out I was DMing, yeah. And before that, I was playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in various incarnations, which just got ridiculous, especially with the third edition Fantasy Flight version. The preparation I was doing was insane. I was making interactive PDFs for it, which I never used. Beautifully graphic design and the whole thing. It's just stupid. And
that's not the game's fault, though, is it?
What?
That's not the game's fault, though, is it?
No, it's not the game's fault. But in this case, it kind of was, because that game had all these components and just all this stuff that came with it. Which, of course, it was released by a board game company. Yeah,
exactly.
So they came out with a gazillion cards and everything for it. So when I started playing DCC, I thought, look, we're going to play this every week. I want to do an hour's prep before each game. So I started an hour earlier than everybody else, and that's all I did during the entire campaign. And I went through almost all of the DCC modules, and I just had to read them beforehand once, jot down a few notes, and I did everything without any fancy preparation. It was great. We had a huge time, and we've sort of put it on hold. We're doing some sci-fi stuff now, and someone else is DMing for a while, but we'll go back to it. It was just absolutely fantastic.
Do you think there's an element of that, which is that, like, your players were more familiar with the Warhammer Old World than they were with Lankmar, and so you could kind of get away with winging it because there was no one who could fact check, or there was less, I don't know, Grognardian concern for the canonical specifics?
No, because my players aren't obsessed with that kind of thing. They don't really care, about.
All right, it was just that the system was sort of.
They just want to kill things and take treasure and have fun and have a laugh,
Nice.
But the problem is that with Warhammer and the other games I was playing, you are sort of trapped in that world, and even if you do play fast and loose, there are restrictions in the world. In Lakmar, okay, I've got the framework of Lakmar. Lakmar City is pretty well developed and everything, but beyond that, you can stick any fantasy in there you want, because if you read Fritz Leiber's books, it's totally off the wall. There's invisible flying creatures and there's an entire invisible race living up in a snow-capped peak. It's some really weird stuff in there. And you could do anything.
I would really have liked to have hung out with that particular group of writers. I can't remember what they called themselves. They're like they were like the new wave of they invented the sword and sorcery term. I think they described them the thing that the 6 of them were doing or whatever. But yeah, they seem like a fun group of guys to go drinking with.
Imagine, and not just drinking, I imagine.
Right. Yeah.
They just it's funny how there just are no rules, which is a shame, because if you read his later books, they start getting a bit weird and puerile and a bit sort of funny later on. But the early ones are just unbelievable. The whole dynamic between Fafet and the Grey Mouse is amazing, and just that whole sort of two adventurers adventuring together kind of thing, which is such a cliche now, but it was so interesting at the time. And of course, they were such distinctive characters. The two of them are so different, and yet they get along really well.
I see. I'm quite used to the preparation part of DMing, because much of my role playing has been done in investigative games like Call of Cthulhu, where you kind of have to know what's going on in the world and do the mystery. So I've got no practice in doing open worldy things, which one of the other guys in my group, whenever he DMs, he just completely wings it and does open world. And I'm like, I'm kind of like, I'm in awe because I don't know how to do it.
Well, I wouldn't call it open world. I mean, I was still using the modules as the basis, and I had sort of various plot ideas and everything. But the thing that I've learned over the years now, and I feel like I'm a pretty experienced DM now, is to say yes to everything. And somebody actually said that in some book somewhere. Just say yes to your players. So instead of saying, no, that doesn't fit my railroading idea of what the plot is, if someone says, I want to do something weird and crazy, just say yeah and go with it and just do it.
Well, that's the first rule of improvisation, is that you never block and you always accept, and then you have to build on it.
There you go.
Yeah. So it's 100% the right approach. I think the other thing is that, like, getting your players into a position where they're allowed to co-invent rather than being in kind of in opposition to your stuff. Like that's always that moment where your RPG group kind of matures into a real storytelling group. It's like, okay, we're all together.
And that was hard to change, because I remember I started doing this with this one, and I said, you come to a pub, and I'd say to someone, what's it called? And they'd go, and the first time I did that, one of the guys said, well, I don't know, you're the game master, you tell us.
Yeah.
And I said, no, you tell me what it is. And after a while they got into it. So I'd say, or they'd do the killing blow or something, and I'd say, right, describe what happens. And
yeah. Those are two really good. Yeah, those are two really good, like, sort of light touch ways of introducing that.
Yeah,
that permission.
I mean, I still want to control everything. I still want to be the DM, but it was, it brought him into it more. And the other thing we did is, because DCC has a whole little campaign set on the Purple Planet, which is kind of John Carter of Mars science fantasy thing. So at one point, the whole campaign went into a sort of Wizard's Tower thing, which went through a portal and got a bit of sci-fi, and then went off to the Purple Planet. So we had a whole thing in the Purple Planet doing science fantasy stuff.
Nice.
And then the whole thing was them trying to get back to Lakmar. Now, I never would have done that stuff in the early days, because I say, oh, that's too weird, those two genres don't mix and everything. We just had a blast. It was so much fun. You don't have to have any rules. And I think that, a lot of these game systems are trying to keep you in this little corridor, and DCC is nice and open. And also the Lakmar system has a luck system, which is great. So I really recommend, if you're playing DCC, to add that, because it's just basically you get luck points and you can use them to do crazy things.
Well, that's interesting, because I've got the core rule book, but I haven't got any of the modules, and it sounds like I'll have a look at a couple of module books and then see if that is what. It seems like I've got the game console, but I don't have any cartridges to put in the game console yet.
Yeah, it is kind of that. Yeah. And because the modules themselves sort of describe different monsters and things like that, and they're different in every module, so there isn't any sort of monster manual or anything like that.
Got it.
So yeah, I really recommend it. It's a great system, simple, and it gets out of the way. So now we thought, oh, let's play some science fiction, and we just thought, oh, we'll use Starfinder, and I'm really enjoying playing science fiction, and the other guy in our group is doing the DMing. He's doing a fantastic job. But the Starfinder rule system is terrible. It's just it's so full of rules. It's ridiculous. And they get in the way of the game. For my style of play, they get in the way of the game. It's just too many bloody rules. I really don't need to know in a combat system that I can spend one action point to sidestep 2 squares. And, it's ridiculous. It's all theater of the mind for me. We started using like maps and things, and I'm going, I can't imagine this. When I look at a map of it restricts my imagination. If you describe it to me, I can imagine all kinds of cool things.
Yeah,
if I look at a map, I'm restricted.
I've never used miniatures, and I've very rarely used maps other than, very broad sketches. So I find that kind of tactical element of role-playing games, like, it's completely alien to me.
Yeah.
And so, like, most of the games I've played, like, combat has been really sort of abstracted and sort of, there's a couple of cinematic snapshots, but there isn't like a whole sort of you know, once we get into an initiative rounds and there's, you know, people rolling exchanges of dice, like I feel like we've left role-playing game land and we're in some other kind of, I know that's not a, you know, that's not the same experience for everyone, but for me, that's, again, it's probably,
I found another trick for that too.
Oh yeah.
There's another trick for that, because it can end up a sort of exchange of blows and rounds and things. The thing I've found is to shake up either or both the environment or the adversaries. So when you meet something you're going to fight, you could say, okay, we're just going to fight us against them. That's it. However, if halfway through the game, a secret door opens and somebody else walks into the battle, suddenly the whole situation's changed.
I
mean, whose side are they going to go on? Do you have to shout at them in the middle of the battle and tell them what to do? By the same token, if the whole room starts tilting and the floor starts tilting, it's like, what? Now I've got to, you know, try not to go into the spikes.
Keep the situation dynamic so that people have to keep
changing.
Yeah.
And that makes it interesting, because everyone's imagining what's going on instead of just saying, oh, I'm rolling dice to hit, you know, defend, blah, blah, blah. They're actually seeing in their head this whole situation. It's like the Indiana Jones thing. You just keep ratcheting up the tension and the things that happen. You know, that fantastic battle where Indiana Jones is on the fixed wing craft fighting the German guy, and things keep happening. You know, then the fixed wing aircraft starts turning around, that it hits the barrels, and you know, that gets close to the fire, and you know, that kind of thing. That can really make a game exciting.
That sounds very much like we were talking about, you know, units just charging into the middle of the battlefield and getting stuck in an exchange of dice rolls. And it's the same reason units can move in Hobgoblin is the same you're describing there, where it's like, well, I want to keep changing the situation so that there's always a new piece of information I have to consider.
That sounds like a perfect.
Peter, thanks for having me.
We've folded it up. We've turned it around and brought it back in.
Thanks for the DCC advice. I'm going to give that a little bit more of a look.
Give it a go. Good luck with the campaign. It looks absolutely fantastic. I'm definitely going to be playing it, and I'm definitely going to be doing a battle report.
Amazing.
Showing it off. I can hardly wait. Gaslands is one of my favorite games, so I'm expecting big things from this one as well.
Yes.
Anytime.
I will attempt to deliver on that hope.
No, it's going to be great. So thanks, Mike. Thanks for having a chat. Thank you for watching, everybody. And basically get Hobgoblin.
Click the link, do the thing, search for Hobgoblin on Kickstarter.
There'll be a link in the show notes.